The Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, has courageously challenged the extreme ideology of greenism in a landmark speech which warned that the net zero agenda and its policies could crush British businesses if not implemented properly. Speaking today at the Innovation Zero conference, she told technology entrepreneurs that climate policy is at a fork in the road, going on to say that the first path is one I do not want to take us down. It is one with an ever-increasing and narrowing set of targets where the government dictates outputs and prices, and a net zero leviathan of central planning crushes our brilliant enterprise economy. These astute concerns complement the sensible delays made by the Prime Minister to some of the net zero deadlines, such as the 2030 new petrol and diesel car ban or the boiler tax. But while the Energy Secretary declared the alternative direction of travel as one that still includes a vision of net zero, I would suggest an alternative vision for the direction away from eco-fanaticism. Imagine a world where we've made use of cheap gas resources, where our gas power stations remained on indefinitely. The moment we turn them on and off intermittently, which is not only inefficient, but also means providers charge higher prices to consumers. Imagine a world in which we wouldn't have to decarbonise our grid by 2035, which will cost you £105 billion, or 2030 in the Labour Party's case, which will cost you an additional £116 billion. In the past year, just over a third of our energy came from renewable resources. But in a world in which the grid is fully decarbonised, where on earth would the rest of our energy come from? The answer is nowhere, so we'd be needlessly facing blackouts. The world without grid decarbonisation would lead to a world in which we would provide cheap energy for British consumers. Imagine a world in which we wouldn't force consumers to buy electric cars, not least because there aren't enough charging points across the country, but also because they can't travel long enough distances or pull heavy enough loads, not to mention the fact that the cheapest new one on the market is about £20,000. British consumers would be allowed to keep more of their own money. Similarly, a world in which we didn't force people to buy heat pumps costing up to £14,000 compared to the average boiler of £2,000 would again let consumers keep more of their money. Imagine a world in which our economy was competitive and houses warm because electricity costs 17 cents per kilowatt hour as it does in the United States, rather than the 44 cents it currently costs here. Well, the point is, we don't need to imagine this world. It is well within our grasp. We can delay the net zero agenda, provide cheap energy for British consumers, let markets lead the way with British consumers free to make their own choices and unleash Britain's economic growth. This doesn't have to be a fantasy. We can make this Britain's reality. The real fantasy is net zero by 2050. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm joined now by Dale Vince, founder of Ecotricity and a Labour supporter. Dale, thank you very much for joining me. I think this is a really important speech by Claire Coutinho saying that we can't move before the technology is ready and that we only make 1% of the emissions anyway, and we've done our share of the heavy lifting.
Well, you know, I thought it was big on rhetoric, light on fact, actually. The idea that the technology is not here for a starter is untrue. All of the technology we need for the green transition is with us now. The idea that it will cost us more to implement it is not true. It's cheaper to go green than not. The OBR told us that a few months ago. You'll have probably read their report. It'll cost twice as much to stick with fossil fuels as it will to transition to green energy. And the idea that we have central planning and prices dictated by the government is also untrue.
Well, as you know perfectly well, green energy is more expensive because currently it has to have hydrocarbon energy on standby, and that means you have the capital cost of the carbon fuels to be ready, and you have to have the extra cost of starting up and running down the power station run on gas, which is much more expensive. There's huge costs created by green energy.
Well, I dispute the conclusion that because of that, green energy is more expensive than fossil fuels.
So where do you attribute the cost of that then?
The cost is in the grid. It's real. It's not as big as it's made out to be, but it does not make the cost of renewable energy more than the cost of fossil fuels. The cheapest forms of energy we have available to us now are from the wind and the sun. And Rees, I don't know if you're aware, but we spend £16 billion a year subsidising the fossil fuel industry. That's £500 per household.
But that's nonsense. Where does that subsidy come from? Explain that subsidy.
This is a report by the IMF. Last year, the UK spent 16 billion subsidising fossil fuels.
There are no subsidies for fossil fuels. This is simply untrue. This is an argument made by the Green lobby with no evidence for it.
I'm talking about the IMF. Is that a Green lobby?
Well, the IMF gets lots of things wrong. Its forecasts of the UK economy have been consistently wrong. But tell me where these subsidies are.
Well, I haven't read
the only ones people have ever mentioned.
I read the conclusion.
You read the conclusion. Well, why don't you read the full document, come back on and tell me where these subsidies are? Because no one who's come on has been able to point to these subsidies for fossil fuels.
I'm pointing to one
no,
right
tax
now.
breaks are not subsidies. The two are completely different. Any business that buys capital assets is allowed to write that asset off against tax because it is a cost of doing business. You're saying companies should be taxed on their cost of doing business in a way no other business is. That's not a subsidy.
I'm talking about tax relief over and above the normal write-downs that businesses can apply.
They don't get beyond the 100% write-offs that ordinary businesses get. They get 100% write-off of investment in assets.
Rosebank in the North Sea, Rishi Sunak gave them £3 billion of our money to a Norwegian energy company, and the oil that it makes will never even land here.
The money they get through tax is for dismantling assets that have a high cost, and that they can offset against their tax bill. But that's true of all businesses. There is no subsidy for fossil fuels in this country, which are enormously heavily taxed. If you fill up your car with petrol, you will see how heavily taxed fossil fuels are. There is the windfall tax on energy companies. It's just not true to say they are subsidised, and you know that. You're far too clever to be making these things up.
You missed what I said about Rosebank.
Rosebank is a new investment. It hasn't got government money to do it. It will be a commercial opportunity.
That's not true. It's £3 billion of government money given to a Norwegian energy company. Do you not know
this is being done on a commercial basis. Rosebank is a commercial opportunity, and the gas will generate profit and tax for the country. And you've also let's come back also to your point on the technology not being there, because that's not what Claire said. Claire said the idea that there was no better technology to be developed was false, and surely that's true.
I was responding to what you said, Rees, at the start of it when you spoke to me. You said that's what you said, the technology wasn't here yet.
She said in her speech, have you read her speech?
I've read news reports of it.
OK, so you haven't read her speech, which you said was light on detail. So it's pretty pointless doing an interview on it if you haven't bothered to read it.
Everything you said, I've read. Everything you said, I read, and I say that's light on detail. That's just rhetoric.
But actually, I was referring to her speech, which you couldn't be bothered to read.
I read about it in the news, and you repeated everything that I've read about.
There's no point in not bothering to do your homework before coming on. Thank you, Dale.
You should do your homework.
I'm joined now by James Alexander, the Chief Executive of UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, who may actually have taken the trouble to read the speech and know a bit about it.